Hi, it's Gretta. Are you struggling with anxiety, trust issues, or sleepless nights after being ghosted? If so, you could be experiencing post-betrayal syndrome, the emotional and physical aftermath of betrayal. As a certified post-betrayal transformation coach, I created Heal and Move On After Ghosting, a powerful new program to help you reclaim your life. Together, we'll work through a proven framework to rebuild your confidence, trust, and emotional well-being. Visit copingwithghosting.com/group or click the link in the show notes to reserve your spot. And I can't wait to work with you.
'Cause you ghosted me. I can't believe you're just a memory. Oh, why did you have to leave?
Listener discretion is advised. Today's episode covers sensitive topics that may evoke strong emotions, and this content is unsuitable for children. Please prioritize your mental health while listening. If you feel uncomfortable at any point, it's okay to pause, take a break, or turn it off. I'll pause now to give you a moment to decide. Welcome to Coping with Ghosting, the podcast that offers hope, healing, and understanding for anyone who's ever faced the painful experience of being ghosted. I'm Greta, your host, and today we're discussing a topic that's really close to my heart, and that is depression, because many of us, myself included, have felt the weight of depression after being ghosted. And I have a special guest today. I'm thrilled to be joined by Jeremy Godwin, an Australian counselor, host of the wonderful podcast, Let's Talk Mental Health, and author of the new book, Life Advice That Doesn't Suck. With his practical research-backed tips, Jeremy helps people transform their lives one small step at a time. Welcome to Coping with Ghosting, Jeremy.
Thank you, Greta. Thank you for having me, and hello, everyone.
One thing I really appreciate about your podcast are the stories that you share about your life and your journey with mental health. And so for any listeners that may not know you, could you please share some of your experiences with depression and anxiety and how it led you to where you are today?
Absolutely. So I spent a couple of decades, probably more decades than I should admit to in public, working in the corporate sector and doing a whole bunch of stuff that was everything but what I probably should have done for my mental health, and really not looking after myself. And eventually what that led to was a total breakdown in late 2011. And it wasn't like I just woke up one day and that was sort of, that's it, I can't function. It dragged on for probably a good 6-month period where it was up and down. And that then led to extremely severe depression and anxiety. It lasted for probably 2 or 3 years, the worst phase of it. And it was at the point where for quite a few months, I couldn't even leave the house to go and get the mail from the letterbox, let alone go out and do the things that I used to do. Even just going to the supermarket it was painful. I needed like 3 or 4 days in bed to recover from the emotional and the physical kind of exertion that came out of doing something just like that. And so that really, it put me in a corner because everything I knew about myself had gone out of the window overnight, it felt. And I needed to figure out who I was as I started to slowly emerge, sort of a few years later, started to slowly emerge from this extreme depression and anxiety. And I had to also try to understand how I was going to live with these conditions. So that took me down a path of learning about mental health. I distinctly remember a day in late 2013 sitting in my therapist's office in a session, and all of a sudden I went, what you're doing is what I want to do. Like I had just that little moment, that little crack of clarity had flooded through the darkness, and it just felt like a beacon. And so I went back to study, which not easy when you can barely function, and but eventually got a degree in psychology and sociology because I'm fascinated with individuals and groups. And long story short, ended up eventually working in the mental health space. It took me a few years to really find the confidence and the direction that I wanted to take. And so in 2019, I was working in a totally different job where I was kind of barely even using the degree that I'd done. I finished up with that job and I just thought, I need a creative outlet. I think I'll start a podcast just for something to do. And I was so excited the first week because I got 4 listens. One of them was me, but hey. But yeah, now this is what I do 5 years later. I get to talk to people around the world and really educate as much as I possibly can around what it means to deal with these types of mental health experiences, but more importantly, to share my own story along with quality research to show that there is a way to overcome these challenges. Depression isn't the end of the world. You can learn how to live with it and you can thrive in spite of it.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. I got goosebumps. That is so empowering and such a turnaround. And you're just helping so many people with your podcast. I'm such a huge fan. It's almost surreal to talk to you because I've listened to so many episodes. I hear your voice and I'm like talking to you, and it's like, wow, I'm kind of fangirling right now.
Oh, that's nice. Thank you.
Many people listening are struggling after being ghosted. How can someone tell if they're dealing with a temporary case of the blues or facing something more serious like depression?
That is a really great question. And if I may first of all say, ghosting sucks. I have been ghosted myself. I was ghosted by one of my closest friends a few years back, and it still stings to this day. So if you are struggling with going through this experience, know that it is okay and you will eventually come out the other end. But specifically to your question around depression, we have to understand that struggling is a completely natural and common response to loss, not to mention the kind of shock that's involved with any kind of loss. And so there is a grieving process that happens when somebody is ghosted. And at the same time as grieving the actual loss itself and not knowing where to put those emotions that you might have directed towards that individual, at the same time, you're trying to make sense of everything. And both of those things take time to figure out. So if you are feeling down, depressed, however you want to describe things, it's first of all important to understand that you have to feel what you need to feel and you have to go through that process. And there isn't a pill that you can pop. There isn't a podcast that you can listen to that's going to give you one magical cure. What you need to do is chip away and learn day by day how to find a space to accommodate that loss and to process it and work and to integrate it into your life and around it. However, back to the question about depression. So when we factor in the fact that there's grief involved, grief, depending on the length of the relationship, the closeness of the relationship, grief is not a one size fits all. Some of us bounce back from grief in 3 to 6 months. For some of us, it takes 6 to 12 months or more. And that's okay. We all go at our own pace and you have to allow yourself the time. So 2 things I would encourage any of you to think about. First is the longer the relationship, the longer it's probably going to take you to process the loss. And again, it's not just about processing your emotions regarding the loss, it's about figuring out a way forward and how do you integrate that loss into your life? How do you accommodate the space that has been left? How do you honor the relationship that was, but move forward with the loss, actually being part of who you are? Grief is one of those things that's really hard to put a very specific number on. But if you are finding that you are struggling to get enjoyment out of things that you used to do, or you're shutting yourself away from the world, and that's going on for weeks and months, that's when the alarm bells need to be ringing, because depression is a completely natural response to grief. But severe depression can coexist and can be triggered or worsened as a result of that grief and that loss that you're processing. So really, those tend to be the big hallmarks. It's that loss of enjoyment for life itself, and it's the just very little emotional or physical energy to do anything. If you're presenting any of those signs, please go and speak with a doctor immediately, if not sooner. Feel free to pause this podcast and go and talk to your doctor and then come back. Hope you don't mind me saying that, Greta.
No, that's great. I've definitely had my own battles with depression, and I experienced a lot of what you're talking about. It's like changes in my sleep schedule, constant chronic
Mm,
fatigue, appetite
mhm.
changes. I had, I did struggle with thoughts of self-harm. So I know what it feels like to feel hopeless. And I totally agree that if anyone's feeling this and it's happened for a while now, definitely pause and get some help because your life matters. You are so important, and
Absolutely.
you can turn this around.
Absolutely 100%. And if I could please pick up on your point about self-harm, and trigger warning to anybody listening here, but I did want to pick that up and thank you for bringing that up. And I myself have been in that position. I talk very openly in my podcast, which is very how-to oriented. And I
Mhm.
do talk openly, maybe less these days now, but about the fact that I have made several attempts on my own life, and I'm quite open about that. And at first, I was ashamed of that. And now I see it as an opportunity to help others recognize that they are not alone. That,
Mhm.
through a lot of therapy and a lot of self work, I've reached a place in my life where I understand that all of these things have happened, and it's part of the process of working your way through it. There's nothing wrong with you if you are depressed or living with anxiety, or both, because they very often tend to go hand in hand. So please be kind and gracious to yourself, but never, ever, ever allow the thoughts that you are alone to take over, because you are not alone. There are people who love you and care for you and will be there if you just reach out and ask for help.
Exactly. And I'm definitely going to add a link to some of those resources, the international suicide hotlines, that type of thing, to the show notes today. So anyone who wants to follow up can call those numbers. So we talked about a few different ways to get help. For those who might be recognizing the signs of depression, what steps exactly would you recommend for them to take?
Great question. First of all, at the very first signs or question marks that you have, start writing down what some of the symptoms are that you're experiencing, and just keep a track of your mood. That's the easiest way to start in terms of just developing your own understanding. As quickly as possible, please go and speak to your doctor. If you don't feel comfortable speaking to your doctor, you've got the wrong doctor and you need to go find someone new. And I say that emphatically. You please do not allow your relationship with your doctor to be the thing that holds you back from having the conversation that you need to have. I have a motto on my show that's been there pretty much since day one, which is the more we talk about it, the easier it gets. And that has definitely been the case for me. I distinctly remember the very first honest conversation that I had with my doctor back in 2012, where I told him exactly what was going on. I'd kind of like maneuvered around it a little bit and was describing some of the physical symptoms, but without allowing myself to admit what I was going through in my head. And when I actually sat down and spilled everything out, it was like a weight off my shoulders, so much that I actually cried after the release of it. And it's the thing that set me off on the path to recovery. It was the hardest conversation I have ever had in my entire life. And it's the best conversation I've ever had in my life. The second best conversation is the one that I then had later that day with my partner, to then admit everything that I was going through. And so, again, I bring myself back to that thing. The more we talk about it, the easier it gets. Because one of the things that happens with depression in particular is that it thrives on a sense of isolation. And you are not alone at all. So talk about it as much as possible. Never be ashamed to talk about it. And then there are lots of other things that you do. And again, I talk about all this stuff in my show, but I just really want to highlight that it's probably going to be a long journey to deal with things, and you need to be mindful of that. Again, there isn't a pill that you can pop that will magically fix everything. It can support you, antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications, etc. But it really does come down to putting in the work. So things like therapy and a lot of self-work in terms of constructive self-care, making lifestyle changes. That's definitely a big one. I was in the worst of my own depression and anxiety. I had an ongoing problem with alcohol. I finally quit drinking permanently in 2016, and since then I've managed to stabilize and really get things under control. So, getting rid of those unhealthy coping mechanisms is always going to help you along the way as well. I feel like I've just given like a laundry list of things that you can do, but please go talk to your doctor. That's the first and foremost thing.
I appreciate everything you just said so much. And I think that one day at a time, one step at a time, maybe somebody isn't ready today, and that's okay. It's just something you can start thinking about. You could also start calling your friends,
Mm-hmm.
family, join a support group or an online mental health community. Those are a few other ways to connect with people and talk it out. Unfortunately, so many people don't understand how painful being ghosted can be. So I think that it's really important to try to talk it out with people who are compassionate and empathetic to what you're going through as well.
Absolutely. I think this is the reason why this podcast, for example, is so important, because you are bringing together a group of people to effectively share experiences and to hear from others who have been in, dealing with similar type of stuff. And the thing with, like I said, with depression, the same with the way that you process through something like ghosting, which is hugely soul destroying in a lot of ways. It's to be able to recognize first and foremost that you aren't alone, and that knowledge in and of itself, that it's not just you that this happens to a lot of people, and it's a really horrible thing that happens. And there are probably 50 million different reasons why people ghost, and realistically most people aren't great with confrontation, so they kind of like shy away from it. But ultimately what it comes back to is you are not alone, and learning from the experiences of others. It may not apply to your own situation, but damn, it feels good to know that you're not alone. That's how I felt with depression. It was once I realized that it wasn't just me dealing with this stuff. 2 years into it, I was having a conversation with my aunt, and out of nowhere, she said, "Oh yeah, I was diagnosed with depression. I was on anti-anxiety and antidepressants for like 3 years, a few years back, because of this bullying thing at work." And I'm like, could you have maybe told me that at the beginning? But for her, it took a long while for her to feel comfortable. So anyway, that's my point.
Yeah, we all need to share what's on our hearts, build
We do.
community.
The more you talk about it, the easier it gets. And I cannot emphasize enough what you just said about one day at a time. It's something I talk about a lot in my podcast. When we think 15 days ahead, or 15 weeks ahead, or 15 months ahead, that's when the anxiety and the overwhelm often comes in. Realistically, all you have to do is focus on today, right? If you feel rubbish today, you don't need to worry about what tomorrow is going to look like. Just focus on what you need to do to get yourself through today. And if that's too hard, you know what? Chunk it down to like 4-hour blocks. I have had the privilege of coaching somebody through getting through substance addiction, and that 4-hour block thing works magic. It's something that I applied myself when I was quitting drinking, in terms of, and also when I quit smoking a few years back, was to really be able to just say, all right, I don't need to think about this evening. Let me just focus on the morning is 8 a.m. to 12 p.m. I'm going to get through that, and then I'll regroup and go from there. 12 to 4, 4 to 8. It actually, what it does is it limits choice and it limits focus. And that way the brain can just kind of go, all right, I don't need to think about things. I can just bring my focus back to this 4-hour block, and that's going to help to keep me on track.
That's such a good life hack. Thank you for sharing that.
Mm. works wonders for a whole bunch of stuff. Like if you're overwhelmed or stressed with work or whatever the case might be, just chunk it down to 4 hours. 4 hours are easy, right? So anybody coming up to the holidays who has to deal with family, just chunk it down to 4 hour blocks and you'll be fine.
That's awesome. If you had to pinpoint one habit that made the biggest difference for you in your emotional recovery, what would it be?
Aside from quitting drinking, no question there, it's the focusing on one day at a time. I am an overthinker, an overplanner, an overtalker, as you can tell. And my default space is to go straight to the steps 16, 17, and 18 when I really need to focus my energy on step one. So consciously doing that. So I sit here every morning at the start of my day and just make a plan that is focused on that specific day. And I keep it to only 2 or 3 things that I'm focusing on for work and personal. And that is and I remind myself of that several times throughout the day. So that has worked wonders for me because it calms my crazy monkey mind that bounces around all over the place.
Wow, that's really good advice. Thank you. I wanted to share mine. So,
Please, I'd love to hear.
yeah, because I battled with depression a lot
Hmm.
and I felt disconnected, lost, and like an outsider for a lot of my life. What really helped me shift my perspective the most was actually when I deep dived into religion and spirituality, and I started believing in things that were greater than myself. And I found ways to really make sense of the unfair circumstances around me and find deeper meaning in
Mm.
life. And when I changed my perspective and my view of the world and the people in it, I started viewing the people who ghosted me as teachers. And that was, I think, the biggest change for me in terms of helping me get out of my depression. It's just how like shifting my mindset.
That is fantastic. Anytime that we can turn adversity into opportunity, and it takes a long time to get to that point, but I have said this in my podcast a couple of times now. I now look back on my breakdown and my depression and anxiety that followed, and all of the other things that kind of came out of that. I'm actually thankful that it happened.
Yeah.
Now, would I choose it for myself again? No, 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 no. Absolutely not. Categorically not. So please don't send that my way, universe. However, I wouldn't change what happened for the world
Okay.
because it has taught me so much. And without it, I would probably still be working in the corporate sector doing a job that I absolutely loathed and didn't realize how much I hated it. And I wouldn't be doing this work that I do where I get to talk to people from around the world like you and share our experiences and do something that feels like it's actually making a difference in the world. So anything that you can do to take a step back and say, all right, this is not great, but what is the lesson here? And more importantly, what is the opportunity? How do I take this and turn it into something positive? It's why I started my podcast. I wanted to share the information that I had learned, but more than that, I really wanted to put stuff out there that was what I was looking for when I was in my deepest, darkest hours. I would sit there on my iPad going through trying to find stuff, and the majority of it was theory based, and you could kind of tell that it was written by people who hadn't experienced what it was like to not even be able to drag yourself out of bed for the fourth day in a row. And that's the stuff that I needed. And so when my brain kind of started clearing up enough to be more communicative, that's when I went, all right, well, what do I do with this and how do I put it out there? And so there are opportunities in everything, no matter what.
Yes. And you've done such an excellent job. Everybody who hasn't listened to the podcast, please go. I'll put a link to your show in our show notes as well. It's amazing. I love it.
Thanks.
What words of comfort would you like to share with listeners who are really hurting after being ghosted?
I know you've probably heard this 1,000 times, and if you haven't, you're probably going to hear it 1,000 times, but I need you to hear this from the heart. It really does get better. It's just that it takes time, effort, and perseverance. And that's kind of the bit that people don't add on to the end of it, because it's easier to tell someone, oh, it gets better, you'll be okay. But take it from somebody who has been there. It's the time, effort, and perseverance part that actually helps you to recover, because when you put in the work and the effort and the energy that goes in processing this stuff and healing from it, that's actually what creates the healing itself. It doesn't just happen because time passes. You put in the work, and that's when you feel that you've made steps forward, because every single situation will help you to move forward if you apply the effort and the energy.
And it's so worth it.
It totally is. It totally is. And then you'll be able to get to talk to other people and say, ghosting sucks, and what can I do to support you?
Is there anything else you'd like to add about ghosting, being ghosted, or
Mm.
dealing with the aftermath?
Yeah, look, other than saying that ghosting sucks and it should be banned, what I really want to say is that please understand that the choice to ghost is that person's choice. It is not a reflection on you. There is nothing wrong with you. It is about them and where they're at in their life. And so the thing that's really hard to get our heads around is that it feels really personal, but it's actually not. And so remind yourself of that, understand that. And I know that for most people, it will take time for you to be able to not only hear that and process it, but integrate it and actually accept that as a fundamental truth. But the more you remind yourself that this isn't actually about you, it is them and where they are at, the more that you can start to get away from the really challenging mental health stuff that happens with ghosting, right? Where we start to question our worth and our validity and our identity and all of these things. No, 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 no. Do not ever let somebody take away your sense of self-worth, because they made a choice based on who they are and where they're at in life. The fact that they don't like confrontation or whatever the case might be, got nothing to do with you. You're just an you're just the recipient of what happened, all right? And you remind yourself of that and you will be okay.
Yeah, it's not your fault. You didn't
It's not
deserve
your.
this.
Now, I could have just said it's not your fault, but I said it in about 500 words instead. So, you did not deserve this.
Yeah. No, and I like how you elaborated on it. I like all of the points that you just made. It's so important. And I never get tired of hearing it because it's just such a validation for me that it really wasn't my fault. It wasn't my fault that I was on a haunted merry-go-round of ghosts constantly treating me
Right.
like with disrespect. Yeah,
Mhm.
it never gets old for me. It wasn't your fault. So important.
I mean, I'm 6 years on from the last time that I spoke to my friend, and it's still, I'll be making coffee and it'll pop up, right? Or I'll be
Yeah.
like doing the groceries and it'll pop in my head, and I'm like, where did that come from, for starters? But also, it's okay. Like, it's don't think that there is a timeline on your processing of this. And even when you process it, it's like a whack-a-mole game. You're going to have to probably bop it on the head quite a few times over the next couple of decades. And that's just part of the process of dealing with these memories. Because the brain likes to pop these things up and go, hey, remember this? Because it's trying to keep you safe. But just remind your brain, I'm okay. I'm processing things. I'm good. Thank you for reminding me of that horrible, painful time in my life, but I'm good.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I've grown around my grief as well. And sometimes
Mm,
I still have nightmares about the people who ghosted me, but
mhm.
they're far and few between. So I think that the more healing we can do, the better, so that the thoughts kind of dissipate.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree.
Mhm. Well, how can listeners connect with you?
Well, first of all, as you mentioned, there's my podcast, Let's Talk About Mental Health, which is available on all the platforms as well as YouTube Music and Amazon Music. I also do a weekly video on YouTube, so you can find me there. But the best place to find me is on Instagram at LTA Mental Health, or you can just head over to my website at ltamh.com.
Lovely. Thank you so much for joining me today. This has been incredible. I am so grateful that you took the time to be here. And Yeah, I'm so thankful.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it, Greta, and all the best to everyone.
And friends, I invite you to follow Coping with Ghosting on social media, join my free and private Coping with Ghosting Facebook support group, and please leave a rating for the show because many listeners have told me that they wish they discovered this podcast earlier when they were first ghosted. And so by leaving a rating and a review, you can help make this podcast more visible for those who truly need support now. So thank you so much to everyone who's already left a review or plans on leaving a rating for me. And finally, remember when you're ghosted, you have more time to connect with yourself and with others who have stellar communication skills. You deserve the best.
You're just